The deafening hum of overloading circuits filled the cockpit as Lieutenant Sarah Collins wrestled with the controls. Sparks erupted around her, and the console blared warnings in languages she couldn't decipher. She cursed under her breath. The Stellar Explorer, once the pride of the Earth fleet, had become a tumbling wreck hurtling toward the surface of an uncharted planet. Mayday! Mayday! This is Lieutenant Sarah Collins of the Earth Fleet, Serial 784T9. I'm going down on dash. She checked the unreadable display, somewhere near Zeta Quadrant, Sector 41. Respond. Only static replied. The ship buckled as it breached the atmosphere. Flames licked the edges of the hull as Sarah gripped her seat, bracing for impact. The last thing she saw was a canopy of purple foliage rushing toward her before everything went black. Sarah awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the distant calls of alien creatures. Her body ached, her flight suit torn in several places, but she was alive. The crash site lay in ruins behind her, a smoking crater surrounded by shattered metal. Miraculously, her emergency pack had survived. Surveying the dense jungle, Sarah took a deep breath, inhaling the strange but pleasant aroma of the air. Trees with twisted trunks reached skyward, their leaves shimmering like stained glass under the sunlight. Pulsing blue vines coiled around massive rocks, and bioluminescent insects flitted in hypnotic patterns. She activated her survival scanner, which immediately lit up with readings of the planet's atmosphere. Breathable, she muttered, removing her helmet and letting the alien air fill her lungs. It was eerily quiet, save for a soft hum emanating from somewhere nearby. With no hope of immediate rescue, she knew she needed to find shelter and resources. As she trekked deeper into the jungle, the hum grew louder. Soon, she came upon the source, a colossal stone structure covered in vibrant moss and alien hieroglyphs. It looked ancient, as if it had stood there for millennia. In the center of the ruin, atop a pedestal surrounded by glowing crystals, stood a massive sword embedded in a block of obsidian. Sarah approached cautiously, her boots crunching against the crystalline gravel. She noticed a group of humanoid creatures gathered nearby, their translucent skin glinting in the light. They had no visible mouths, but communicated with soft vibrations and gestures. When they saw her, their bioluminescent veins pulsed in rhythmic patterns, and one stepped forward. "I come in peace," Sarah said, raising her hands. The alien cocked its head, then extended a long-fingered hand. Its touch sent a tingling sensation up her arm, and suddenly, images filled her mind, the sword, countless beings trying to lift it, and failure after failure. Many try. None succeed, the alien's thoughts echoed in her mind. Sarah blinked, struggling to comprehend what just happened. "What is this place?" she asked aloud. The alien gestured toward the sword. Through their telepathic connection, Sarah understood. The sword was a relic of immeasurable power, a gift from the stars, destined for a chosen bearer who could unite the scattered tribes of the planet. No Zorantian had ever succeeded in lifting it, but once a year, during their festival, beings from across the planet came to try. "Interesting story," Sarah said, glancing at the blade. "But I've got bigger problems like finding a way off this rock." The alien tilted its head, as if amused by her ignorance. With a gesture, it beckoned her to follow. As they moved toward a clearing, Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward the sword. It was more than curiosity. It was as if something inside her whispered, "Your destiny lies here." The clearing opened into a massive encampment. Dozens of alien species gathered, each more peculiar than the last, towering insectoids, feathered serpentine creatures, and gelatinous beings that shimmered like water. They all turned to look at Sarah, their expressions ranging from confusion to disdain. "This is going to be a long day," she muttered, clutching her emergency pack tightly. Little did she know, the legend of the sword and her arrival was about to change everything. The alien encampment buzzed with energy as preparations for the annual festival were underway. Sarah walked through the bustling site, feeling like an intruder among the diverse array of beings. Vendors sold strange glowing fruits, artisans displayed intricate carvings of alien gods, and musicians played instruments that emitted hauntingly beautiful sounds. It was as if the entire planet had convened here, all drawn by the allure of the legendary sword. Her Zoranthian guide, who Sarah had mentally nicknamed Luma due to its glowing veins, led her to a large amphitheater carved from iridescent stone. At its center stood the pedestal and the sword, a towering, obsidian blade with alien glyphs etched along its length. It gleamed as if freshly forged, even after countless ages. Around the amphitheater, creatures of every shape and size mingled, their attention fixed on the sword. This is the blade of unity, Luma's thoughts resonated in Sarah's mind. It chooses a bearer only when the time is right. Many have tried. None have succeeded. Sarah frowned, crossing her arms. If it's so impossible, why does everyone keep coming back? Luma tilted its head, its glowing veins pulsing in a slow rhythm. Hope. The amphitheater filled with a low hum as a group of Zoranthians stepped forward, signaling the start of the challenge. One by one, contestants approached the sword, their attempts accompanied by cheers, gasps, or laughter from the crowd. The first to try was a towering reptilian creature with shimmering green scales. It stomped forward, claws clicking against the stone. With a grunt, it gripped the sword's hilt and strained, muscles rippling under its scaled hide. The sword didn't budge. A slender, six-armed being followed, wrapping its many limbs around the hilt in a display of dexterity. It twisted and pulled, but the blade remained firmly lodged in the stone. Each failure seemed to feed the crowd's anticipation, and Sarah noticed the mixture of frustration and awe on the contestants' faces as they stepped away. Why not you? Luma's telepathic voice startled Sarah. She shook her head, laughing nervously. Me? I'm not even from this planet. Look at these guys, they're 10 times stronger than me. I wouldn't stand a chance. Strength is not what the blade seeks. Sarah frowned, steadying the sword. There was something magnetic about it, an almost imperceptible pull that made her skin tingle. She shrugged off the feeling and turned her attention back to the spectacle. The next contestant was a massive, insect-like creature with segmented legs and serrated claws. The crowd roared as it approached the sword. Its attempt was met with a loud cracking sound, not from the sword, but from the creature's strained exoskeleton. It shrieked in frustration and scuttled away. By now, Sarah had begun to notice a pattern. Every being that attempted to lift the sword relied on brute force, as if it were a test of strength. None considered what Luma had said, that strength wasn't the key. Her fingers itched to try, but she suppressed the urge, feeling out of place among these formidable beings. Then the crowd turned toward her. Luma's glowing hand pointed in her direction, and Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that she had been volunteered. What are you doing? She hissed at Luma. You are new. Unseen. The blade may respond. Before Sarah could protest, 2 Zoranthians guided her toward the pedestal. The amphitheater fell silent as hundreds of eyes fixed on her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she climbed the steps, the sword looming larger with each step. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The glyphs along its surface seemed to shimmer with a life of their own, and she swore she could hear a faint hum emanating from the blade. Sarah placed her hands on the hilt, her palms sweaty and her breathing shallow. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation. She closed her eyes, half expecting the sword to electrocute her or refuse to budge, just as it had with the others. But as her fingers tightened around the hilt, she felt a jolt, not painful, but electric, as if the sword had recognized her touch. The hum grew louder, resonating deep within her chest. Without thinking, she pulled. The sword slid free with a smooth, effortless motion. Light exploded from the blade, illuminating the amphitheater in a radiant glow. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Sarah stood there, the sword in her hands, its weight far lighter than she'd expected. What just happened? She whispered, staring at the glowing glyphs on the blade. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. The silence broke as the crowd erupted into cheers, bows, and cries of astonishment. Luma stepped forward, its glowing veins flashing rapidly. "You are chosen. The blade has deemed you worthy." "Worthy for what?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "To unite us. To save us." The weight of those words sank in as the festival shifted from a celebration to something far more solemn. The beings around her no longer looked at her with disdain or curiosity, they looked at her with reverence. Sarah tightened her grip on the sword, the glow reflecting in her wide eyes. She had no idea what she'd just gotten herself into, but one thing was certain: her life, and this planet, would never be the same. The glow of the ancient sword faded to a faint pulse as Sarah descended the amphitheater steps. The crowd parted before her, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. Every alien she passed bowed slightly, their gazes fixed on the weapon in her hands. She could feel the weight of their expectations, heavier than the sword itself. "What do you mean, save you?" she asked Luma as the Zoranthian guided her toward a quiet grove away from the commotion. Luma's glowing veins pulsed in slow waves, its telepathic voice resonating in Sarah's mind. "The shadow tide is coming. The blade awakens only when the darkness threatens to consume us." Sarah frowned, holding the sword in front of her. Its surface was smooth, the alien glyphs etched into it glowing faintly. "What's the shadow tide?" Luma hesitated, as if unsure how to explain. Finally, it gestured toward the sky. "A force of pure destruction. It devours. It corrupts. The last time it came, our ancestors forged the blade of unity to stop it. But they failed. The blade fell silent, waiting for one worthy to wield it." Sarah's grip tightened on the hilt. "And you think I'm that person?" "You are the first in millennia to lift the blade," Luma said simply. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. As crazy as it sounded, she couldn't deny the connection she'd felt when she touched the sword. It was as if the weapon had recognized her, chosen her. But why? She was just a pilot, not some mythical hero. "Okay," Sarah said, shaking her head, "let's say I believe you. What exactly am I supposed to do with this thing? Fight off an ancient evil by myself?" "You will not be alone," Luma said. "The blade has chosen you to unite us. Only together can we stand against the tide." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Unite you? Luma, your planet is filled with species that can barely stand to be in the same room. How am I supposed to get them to fight together?" Luma's glowing veins dimmed slightly, a gesture Sarah interpreted as uncertainty. "That is why the blade chose an outsider. Someone untainted by our divisions." Before Sarah could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, guttural sound echoed through the jungle, followed by distant screams. Luma straightened, its veins flashing brightly. "The tide's vanguard." Sarah instinctively raised the sword. "What does that mean?" "It means they are here." The two of them sprinted toward the sound, the alien jungle blurring around them. The distant cries grew louder, and soon they reached a clearing where chaos had erupted. A group of Zoranthians and other species had gathered to fend off monstrous creatures emerging from the shadows. The creatures were unlike anything Sarah had ever seen: dark, amorphous masses with jagged edges and glowing red eyes. They moved unnaturally, shifting between forms as they attacked. One moment, a creature was a towering beast with claws; the next, it dissolved into a swirling mist, reforming behind its prey. The defenders fought valiantly, but their weapons barely slowed the monsters down. Claws tore through translucent flesh, and cries of pain filled the air. Sarah hesitated, overwhelmed by the scene. She wasn't a soldier. What could she possibly do against these things? Then the sword in her hand began to hum. The glyphs along its blade glowed brighter, and Sarah felt a surge of energy flow through her. The hesitation melted away, replaced by a strange clarity. She gripped the sword tightly and charged into the fray. The first creature turned toward her, its red eyes glowing with malice. It lunged, but Sarah ducked under its claws and slashed upward. The blade cut through the creature effortlessly, and it dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. The other monsters paused, their attention snapping to her. Sarah's heart pounded as more creatures rushed toward her. She dodged and weaved, the sword guiding her movements as if it had a mind of its own. Each strike sent another creature vanishing into smoke, and for the first time, the tide of battle began to turn. Behind her, the defenders rallied. Inspired by her success, they fought with renewed vigor, coordinating their attacks to drive the creatures back. Sarah caught a glimpse of Luma, its veins pulsing as it directed the others. Slowly but surely, the monsters began to retreat. When the last creature vanished into the jungle, a tense silence fell over the clearing. The survivors looked at Sarah, their expressions a mixture of shock and gratitude. She lowered the sword, her arms trembling from the effort. "That," she said between breaths, "was not in the flight manual." Luma approached, bowing its head. "The blade has awakened." The battle was only the beginning. Sarah looked down at the sword. Its glow had dimmed but hadn't disappeared. She could still feel its energy, thrumming faintly in her hands. "If that was just the beginning," she muttered, "what's coming next?" Luma's veins pulsed in a somber rhythm. The shadow tide does not send its vanguard without reason. The true darkness is on its way. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't ready for this. She didn't even know what this was, but she didn't have a choice. For better or worse, the sword had chosen her. And if the shadow tide was as dangerous as Luma claimed, she was the planet's best chance at survival. "Okay," she said, straightening her back. "If we're going to do this, we need a plan. And I need to know everything about this shadow tide." Luma bowed again. "As you wish, chosen one." The title made Sarah cringe, but she didn't argue. As she glanced at the survivors around her, she realized the truth. Like it or not, this fight was now hers. And the sword in her hands was just the beginning of what she would need to become. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation, diplomacy, and training. The survivors of the attack had scattered to their respective factions, carrying tales of the human who wielded the blade of unity. The story spread like wildfire, drawing leaders, warriors, and skeptics from across Zorinth to witness the so-called chosen one with their own eyes. Sarah quickly learned that the legends of the sword were as much a curse as they were a blessing. While many revered her, others challenged her authority, questioning her right to lead a planet she barely understood. But there was no time to indulge doubts. The Shadow Tide's attacks grew more frequent, their vanguard testing the planet's defenses. With each encounter, Sarah felt the sword guiding her more strongly, as if it were alive. The blade whispered strategies in her mind, its alien glyphs glowing brighter when she acted with confidence and purpose. She began to see herself not just as a pilot stranded on an alien world, but as a warrior, a symbol of hope. The Zoranthian leaders gathered in a massive, bioluminescent dome carved into the side of a mountain. Inside, glowing fungi illuminated the cavernous hall, and the air was thick with tension. Representatives of the various factions, reptilian warriors, crystalline diplomats, and sectoid strategists, and others argued heatedly. "This human cannot unite us," bellowed a towering avian alien, its feathers shimmering with an angry red hue. "She is an outsider, unproven and unworthy." "She lifted the blade when none of us could," countered a crystalline being, its voice resonating like chimes. "The blade has chosen her." "That does not mean she can lead," hissed an insectoid with mandibles clicking angrily. "We cannot risk everything on a myth." Sarah stood at the center of the chamber, the blade of unity strapped to her back. She'd never been much for politics, and the endless bickering was wearing her patience thin. Finally, she stepped forward, raising a hand for silence. To her surprise, the room quieted, the alien leaders turning their attention to her. "Listen," she began, her voice echoing in the chamber. "I don't care if you trust me or not. I didn't ask for this sword, and I didn't ask for your war. But the fact is, the shadow tide is coming, and we don't stand a chance unless we fight together." A murmur spread through the room, but Sarah pressed on. "You all think the blade is some kind of magic solution? It's not. It's just a tool. The real power is in what we do with it. If we let our differences divide us, the tide will destroy us all." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Luma stepped forward, its glowing veins pulsing brightly. "The chosen one speaks the truth. The shadow tide feeds on division. Unity is our only hope." The crystalline diplomat nodded, its light shimmering in agreement. "Let us set aside our doubts. The time has come to fight as one." One by one, the leaders voiced their assent. Some were hesitant, others begrudging, but by the end of the meeting, a fragile alliance had been formed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The following days were consumed by preparation. The factions pooled their resources, crafting weapons, building defenses, and training their warriors. Sarah worked tirelessly, coordinating efforts and learning everything she could about the shadow tide. The more she discovered, the more she realized how dire the situation was. The tide wasn't just an enemy, it was a force of nature, a creeping darkness that consumed everything in its path. Its vanguard was only a fraction of its true power. If they didn't stop it here, Zorinth would fall, and the tide would continue its march across the galaxy. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah trained with the blade. It was more than a weapon, it was a partner, responding to her movements and thoughts with eerie precision. She learned to channel its energy, using it to create protective barriers, unleash waves of light, and even heal minor wounds. But the more she relied on it, the more she felt its pull. The blade demanded unity not just from those around her, but from within herself. The final battle began on the eve of the planet's 3 moons aligning. The shadow tide's forces poured out of the jumbles and waves, an unending mass of darkness and red eyes. The defenders stood ready, their ranks a patchwork of Zorintha's diverse species. At the center of the line stood Sarah, the blade of unity glowing brightly in her hands. "Hold the line," she shouted, her voice amplified by the blade. "For Zorinth!" The armies clashed in a deafening roar. Sarah moved like a force of nature, the blade carving through the tide's creatures as if it were made for this purpose. She wasn't alone, her newfound allies fought with a ferocity born of desperation and hope. Reptilian warriors formed shield walls, crystalline beings rained energy blasts from above, and insectoids burrowed beneath the enemy lines, ambushing from below. But the tide was relentless. For every creature they defeated, more took its place. The battle dragged on, and exhaustion began to set in. Sarah could feel the sword's energy waning, its light flickering as the strain of the fight took its toll. "Sarah!" Luma's voice echoed in her mind. "The Nexus. You must reach it." She turned to see Luma pointing toward a massive black vortex in the distance, the heart of the tide's power. Without hesitation, she rallied a small group of warriors and charged toward it. As they fought their way to the Nexus, the sword grew brighter, its energy surging. The closer they came, the more Sarah felt its purpose. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a key. The blade's power wasn't meant to destroy the tide, but to seal it away. When they reached the Nexus, Sarah raised the sword high. Its light exploded outward, a blinding wave that pushed back the tide's forces. She plunged the blade into the ground, and the glyphs along its surface flared with energy. The Nexus trembled, its dark energy collapsing inward. The ground shook violently as the Nexus imploded, taking the shadow tide with it. The remaining creatures dissolved into smoke, and the battlefield fell silent. When the dust settled, the defenders stood in stunned disbelief. The blade of unity, now dim and lifeless, rested in Sarah's hands. She turned to the crowd, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cheers erupted, the sound echoing across the battlefield. The Zoranthians rushed to her, their gratitude overwhelming. For the first time, Sarah felt like she belonged not as a leader imposed by a sword but as a guardian who had earned her place. As the planet's 3 moons aligned overhead, Sarah looked up at the stars. She knew her journey wasn't over. The blade of unity might have gone silent, but its lessons remained. Unity, she realized, was more than a battle strategy. It was the key to survival for Zorinth, for humanity, and for every world threatened by the darkness. And as long as she held the sword, she would ensure that light prevailed.